Okay, so for those of us who have been married, for those of us who are just about to get married, I wonder if you can still remember the moment when the actual proposal was made. Was it a spectacular public event for you? It wasn't for me. I mean, it was spectacular, but it wasn't public. That seems to be the modern way, doesn't it? So recently one man, he proposed over the intercom on an EasyJet flight to the Greek islands. He just went up, spoke over the intercom to 200 odd people and proposed to his girlfriend. Some people, they get an aeroplane, don't they? And they get a message written in the sky, "Will you marry me?" Has anyone done that? Some people get a big crowd together. I actually saw a YouTube video of this. They get a big crowd together and they stop all the traffic on a motorway so that they can get down and propose on the dual carriageway for some reason. But my favourite involves, would you believe, a Dutchman. About a year ago, a man rented an industrial-sized crane, and the plan was he was going to lower himself down in front of his girlfriend's bedroom window early one Saturday morning, and he was going to sing her a song and pop the question, but unfortunately the crane toppled over and it smashed a big hole in the neighbour's roof. But it's okay, because the man was able to get down and no one was hurt. But sadly, that's not the end of it, because they brought up another enormous crane to try and right the crane that had fallen over, and the crane that had fallen over fell over again. And this time, it completely smashed in the roof, so that 6 apartments had to be evacuated, and the whole building was declared unsafe. But don't worry, the girlfriend said yes. It must be true, I read it in a tabloid. Ruth chapter 3 is a very unusual marriage proposal. We'll get to it in a moment, but let me remind you, I hope it's a reminder for lots of us of what we've learned so far. The message of Ruth chapter 1 was trust God for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, behind all the terrible things that can and do happen to us day by day, he hides a smiling face. Lots of terrible things happened to this woman, Naomi. But hidden from sight, God was at work for her good and for her blessing. And we need to learn to trust God for his grace. And in chapter 2, we saw how God's grace works. Do you remember we said God is not an employer looking for employees who will work for him and who will therefore earn his reward and his blessing. So often we think that's how it works, don't we? We think that's how God works, but that is religion. That is not grace. God is not an employer. Do you remember we said that God is this great winged eagle, and what he's looking for is not employees. He's looking for people who will take refuge under his wings of everlasting love. And that's what Ruth did, and that's what we need to do. You could not be more of an outsider than Ruth. You could not be more of a nobody than Ruth. But grace says all you've got to do is come. Doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. All you've got to do is come. And today we're going to see what happens when this amazing grace really grips people. Do you know, I'd love you to be gripped again today by grace. I really would. Do you know, so far in this story, Naomi has been completely passive. You could say she's been almost paralyzed. You see, that's what happens when you have no hope. You just think, what is the point? That's what hopelessness does to people. But on the other hand, hope. When you have hope, it brings energy. And it brings ideas, and it brings action. Do you know, it's really weird, isn't it, the things that you can remember from years ago. But I can still remember the words that Bill Clinton spoke the night that he was elected president of the USA. It's really strange, isn't it? But I can still remember he said in that kind of southern drawl of his, "I believe in hope." was a play on words. You see, Bill Clinton was born in a little town called Hope, Arkansas. He was born in that little town 3 months after his dad had died in a road accident, and there he was, President of the United States of America. I believe in hope, he said. So here's Naomi. God's grace has been hidden, but now she's seen it, and suddenly, chapter 3, verse 1, hope bursts into life with this plan to get Ruth hitched to Boaz. And it doesn't involve a crane, but it is pretty weird. Okay, I'd love you just to look down, if you got it, on the sheet, just to that first reading. She says to Ruth, tonight Boaz will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Remember, threshing is when you beat the grain to separate the grain from the straw. And then winnowing is when you chuck the grain up in the air and the wind blows through and it blows away all the chaff and the rubbish. I imagine that winnowing the grain is pretty hot, tiring work. But Naomi says, tonight, while he's doing that, you wash. You put on perfume. You get dressed in your best clothes. You wait till he's asleep, and then you go, you uncover his feet, you lie down, implication next to him. Verse 4, he will tell you what to do. I bet he will. We're not children, are we? If Hollywood was telling this story, we know exactly where it would end, don't we? And we wouldn't bat an eyelid. We wouldn't. But we're forgetting something big. In chapter 2, we have seen that Ruth and Boaz both have this standout, godly character of loving kindness. And the thing is, that sort of godly character always shows itself in obedience to God's rule. So God says, be honest. He says, be generous. He says, be careful with your language. He says, sex is for marriage. These things matter to God, and therefore out of obedience to him, they matter to Ruth and Boaz. Do you know, I want to make this absolutely clear. Sinless perfection is impossible. It is absolutely impossible for any of us. But genuine, sincere obedience to God is possible. It was for them, for Ruth and Boaz. And in Christ, it is for us. So if we see what happens on the threshing floor as a seduction scene, then that is us with our 21st century take on it. It is not what the Bible writer wants us to see or what Naomi intended. Okay? The other thing to say is that lying next to a big heap of grain is a bit like lying next to a big pile of Brussels sprouts. It stinks. And after a hard day's work, Boaz, I suspect, was flat out on his back, snoring. I must tell you this story. A few years ago, we went on holiday. We arrived at a beautiful campsite, okay? Everything was lovely. It was so beautiful. There was a really charming family in the next tent along, but it was quite a long way away. We went to bed that night. I settled down to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by the most extraordinary sound. At first, I honestly believed that some stray animal, maybe an alpine cow, had come into the tent. So I got up and I checked all the doors and I checked the children. It was very alarming. And then I realized that this ear-splitting bovine noise was the sound of somebody in the next tent snoring. Unbelievable. So put it all together. I don't think this scene is quite as romantic as it first appears. It stinks, and there's loud snoring, we think. And in fact, I've been told there is no better way to rouse someone from deep sleep than to uncover their feet. And that's what Ruth does. But let's pick it up, second reading. Okay, just that second reading. And verse 9 is the most important verse in the chapter. Naomi had said to Ruth, he will tell you what to do. But actually it's Ruth who takes the initiative. Verse 9, you can imagine, "Bull, who are you?" says Boaz, pretty startled. But look at what Ruth says. She says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." Now we're using the NIV Bible, which stands for the nearly infallible version, but it's not very helpful here. The word for corner of your garment could equally and should be translated your wings. Spread your wings over me, is what Ruth is saying. And we're meant to see the connection with chapter 2. Back there, that's what Boaz loved about Ruth. He was basically saying to her there, because you take refuge under the wings of God, you are the kind of woman I want to cover with my wings. So now Ruth says, verse 9, I want you to do that. I do want to marry you. I want you to be the answer to your own prayer, Boaz. It's a slightly weird way to do things, isn't it? But let me tell you, it's a weird situation. Boaz is much older than Ruth. He is significantly older, and it is hard for an older man to be completely open with a much younger woman about how he feels. Ruth is a widow. She's a foreigner. She's an outsider. She's a nobody. She can't presume anything either. So that's why I think we get this very peculiar but very gracious, godly way of proposing. But there's one more thing in verse 9 we need to think about. And if you hear nothing else this morning, please just hear this. It's the most important thing. Why does Ruth want to do this? Why does she want to marry this older man? Why does she want to accept his proposal? Is it love? Well, it might be, but we're not told that it is. Is it because she wants another husband? Well, that's what Naomi, her mother-in-law, wants for her. But verse 9, Ruth says yes, because Boaz is this thing called a guardian redeemer or redeemer. Now, do you remember this poster? This is from Denton Community Challenge 2 years ago. We called it Road to Rio because the World Cup was in Brazil that summer and Denton Community Challenge happened at the same time. And in the middle of the poster, can you see, there's a picture. It's a picture of the statue that stands above Rio de Janeiro. Do you remember what the statue is called? It's very famous. It's got a very special name. It's called Christ the Redeemer. Christ the Redeemer. Here's the clue. Whenever you see the word Redeemer in the Bible, you're meant to think about Jesus. You're meant to see a connection to Jesus. So just let me think for a second. Why is Jesus the Redeemer? What is redemption? Redemption is where you pay the price to set someone free. You know, today, if someone is kidnapped, for example, by Somali pirates over sort of in the Indian Ocean, you sometimes hear of something being paid called a ransom. A ransom is the price that you pay to set someone free from captivity. So what's that got to do with Boaz? Why does Ruth call him guardian redeemer? Well, in the Old Testament, the guardian redeemer was a family member who was responsible for protecting and for providing for poor relatives in the wider family. You could say perhaps that the guardian redeemer pays the price to set these poor people free from poverty or from losing their inheritance. And these things really mattered then. Boaz is that family member, and Ruth calls upon him to be their redeemer. But can I tell you, the twist in this story, the absolutely brilliant twist, is that in the book of Ruth, Boaz is not the redeemer. The real redeemer is Ruth. The real redeemer is Ruth. In verse 10, Boaz says in reply, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. He's really impressed. He's not just happy that she's saying yes. He's impressed by something. He says, this kindness in accepting my proposal, in asking me to be the Redeemer, is greater than any kindness you've already shown. All that work that you did in the barley field, that's nothing compared to this kindness. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. You see, Boaz sees exactly what's going on. The reason Ruth wants to marry him is not to start a family, it is to rescue a family. The reason that she will marry Boaz is because Ruth is so absolutely committed to Naomi. She's absolutely committed to preserving Naomi's name, Naomi's inheritance, Naomi's family, not her own. Please understand, Ruth was free to marry anyone. She could have married a young guy, anybody at all. That's all that Naomi wanted, that Ruth have a home and a husband. And Ruth says, no. Remember what she says in the first chapter, where you go, Naomi, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. That's what she said, and that's what she's now doing. She could have married anyone, but she lays aside her own interests. She puts aside a family for herself in order to save Naomi's family. It is hugely sacrificial, but it will lead to great blessing for many people. And of course, it points us to Christ the Redeemer, who set aside all his own desires for a family, who set aside all his own desires for security, who set aside all his own desires for popularity in order to rescue a people for himself. Being in very nature God, he made himself nothing. Nothing. The price Jesus paid was his blood shed on the cross. The people Jesus sets free are all captives who will trust in his redeeming blood. And the thing that he sets the captives free from is captivity to sin and death. That is why Christ is the Redeemer. The real Redeemer here, though, is Ruth, but she is just a little signpost that is meant to point us to the cross of Calvary, God's great act of eternal cosmic redemption, the payment of the price to set you and me free. Free. Do you know, as I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think about Hebrews 12, where the author of Hebrews is gushing out with all this stuff, and he said, well, what more can we say? I haven't got time to tell you. I haven't got time to tell you how radical this story is. What about a story in a completely male context where the hero is a woman, where the hero is a widow, where the hero is a foreigner, where the hero is an outsider? What about a story that shows us that the God of the Bible is far more radical than we are? Do you know, people talk about liberation theology. This is liberation theology. I haven't got time to talk about it though, so let's finish with grace. It's the best place to start and the best place to finish. I want to ask you this question. Where does a life like Ruth's life come from? Where does a life of self-sacrifice and self-denial come from? Because that's what it is. Where does the power come from that enables us to live by God's standards? Because Ruth is telling us it is possible. It is possible for you and me to live by God's standards. Where does it come from? It comes from grace. You see, like her, we need to find our rest. We need to find our security. We need to find our identity in Christ. So many of us, we come Sunday by Sunday, but we persist in looking for that identity and that rest in things that cannot give it to us. But Jesus said, the bloke said it yesterday. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. Isn't that extraordinary? Whoever loses their life for me will actually find it. That's what Ruth did. She committed herself totally to the God of Israel, and in doing so she found that she had lost nothing. We've got to see. You and me, we can do the same. We can do the same. And that is where the power to live this sacrificial, self-denying life comes from. Amen.